Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for giving me another opportunity to be here. I appreciate it all the more because after this wonderful performative and entertaining start into the day, it will get really boring. I'm sorry. Welcome back to academia. So what am I going to do here? This is we have been, that was one of the topics. What are you doing here? What sort of methodology are we using? So this is, I'm working on with one text, but I wouldn't say, it's a hermeneutic exercise, and if it's a hermeneutic exercise, it would be what we had heard yesterday, which is a reparative reading, and I'm mostly interested in, because we always have that sort of thing, why literature? I think because literature has its own epistemic power, and well, let's see if this works out, and if I can actually repair something here. Okay, let me see if this works. Oh yeah. Further inland, there's a vast tract which is uninhabited. Above this desolate region dwell the cannibals, who are people apart. This is the epigraph of Juan José Saer's novel El Entenado, which the author borrowed from the histories of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, whom Cicero honored as the pater historiae, the father of history. Saer, born in 1937 in Cerrodino, Argentina, passed away in Paris 2005. Critics and fellow authors highly esteem him as one of the most important Latin American writers, and not just of the 20th century. He is really, I think, a great author. El Entenado, published in 1983, is one of his most profound and disturbing works. Cannibalism, or the figure of the cannibal, constitutes, in a certain sense, the arche, the primal foundation of the narrative. This foundation, however, is an abyss, as the reference to Herodotus already calls into question the possibility of historiography or truthful writing. Herodotus is not only considered the father of history, but is also regarded as a dubious authority due to his lack of reliable sources and often wild claims. This reference also hints at some of Saer's strategies to create ambiguity. What does it mean that there is un pueblo aparte, a people or village apart from what? What does más allá, beyond, signify? And what and where is this total desert? The reader of Herodotus knows that the original Androphagos were the barbaric Scythians, and the beyond refers to the beyond of civilization in the Eurasian steppes of Kazakhstan, northeast of the world known to the Greeks. With the father of history begins the story of the cannibals, and simultaneously the inquiry into the foundation of this story, not only because of doubts about the truth of what is said, but also because of the origin and the cultural as well as textual genealogy of the cannibal, have another father, namely Christopher Columbus, who referred to the supposed man-eaters of the Americas as cannibales. The figure of the cannibal always generates a surplus or added value of meaning. In this surplus, history articulates itself as a Lacanian real, or as the absent cause in the sense of Frederick Jameson. This real eludes historiography, the register of the symbolic, because it is inextricably linked with the imaginary. It is thus retrospective and not representable, only assuming a spectral form in the fiction of a real past. The spectre reveals to later generations what was elusive in the past. The historicity of El Entenado lies precisely in conjuring this absent cause of the figure of the spectral cannibal. The cannibal could become the master signifier of the construction of alterity in Europe because it was connected to the confessional splits ignited by the question of the real presence, the actual embodiment of the divine in the Eucharist. This dynamic of alterity is nourished not only by colonial experiences or phantasms, but it is causally in the sense of the absent cause linked to coloniality itself. In all the early modern debates about the real presence of the Eucharist, which, with its supposed cannibalistic implications, that was one of the Protestants' accusations, none of the parties involved questioned the memorial character of the Eucharist. The ritual commemorates the sacrifice made to enable the redemption of humanity. Thus, the Eucharist is intrinsically linked to an eschatological aspect, as it not only serves as a remembrance, but also points to the end of history, the apocalypse preceding the Last Judgment. Each Eucharistic act is a folding of the past, original sin, sacrificial death and promise of salvation, and the future, apocalypse, Last Judgment, and ultimately the salvation of humanity or damnation into the Eucharistic present. The anticipation of the end of the world is connected to the significance and the function of the cannibal in the colonial context. The absent cause for this semantic surplus of the cannibal is linked to the apocalypse, as the discovery of the new world signified, as Saer shows in El Entenado, the apocalypse of the indigenous worlds. Saer's novel references the catastrophic end of one of the first expeditions to the southern cone of the so-called New World, the periphery of the periphery, Más Allá. This journey was undertaken in 1516, under the command of the navigator Juan Díaz de Solís. 3 ships with 70 men sailed from Sanlúcar de Barrameda in 1515 and eventually reached the estuary of the Rio de la Plata. Solís continued upstream on the Uruguay and the Paraná rivers with 2 officers and 7 men, eventually disembarking, where they fell into an ambush. They were killed, and indigenous people cut off their heads and limbs, roasted their victims, and ate them. Current research suggests that Solís was attacked by the Charruas or by the Guarani, who were believed to practice anthropophagy. However, there is no certainty, as only one chronicler reports this, and he was not an eyewitness. Instead of an eyewitness account of the encounter with the cannibals of the Cono Sur, we have only a dubious textual tradition. The cannibalistic foundational fiction of Argentina is Saer's starting point, particularly a detail that has not yet been mentioned. One member of Solís' expedition survived, a certain Francisco del Puerto, a grumete, that's a cabin boy, who was captured and well treated by the indigenous people. 11 years later, he was rescued and returned to civilization. Little is known about his subsequent fate. Saer models his protagonist, or rather his narrator, since during his captivity he has almost no agency, after the vaguely outlined figure of Francisco del Puerto found in obscure historical sources. The unnamed Entenado in the novel, whose polysemous title I will discuss later, is an orphan, the son of a prostitute and an unknown father. He signs on as a cabin boy for the expedition to South America. The destination is never specified, but the reader understands that they arrive at the estuary of the Rio de la Plata. He joins the captain in a landing party in a small boat. They are attacked by a group of indigenous people called Colastine. All but him are killed instantly, and their bodies are taken away. The Entenado is taken to the village on the riverbank at some distance. Here he witnesses a cannibalistic orgy. His comrades are disemboweled, dismembered, and roasted on a grill like livestock. The indigenous people fall into a feeding frenzy accompanied by excessive alcohol consumption. The gruesome feast is followed by a sexual orgy involving sodomy, incest, and pederasty. Many of the indigenous people are injured, mutilated, or die. Afterwards, they lapse into a melancholic lethargy. The Entenado witnesses all these events. For the rest of the year, the Colastine lead an extremely frugal, organized, and joyless life until the following summer when they hunt the victims for cannibalistic, the cannibalistic festival again. Each year, they spare one of the victims whom they call, like the Entenado, Defgi, D-E-F-G-H-I, Defgi. After witnessing the slaughter and consumption of their comrades and the ensuing orgy, the Defkis are sent back to their own people. However, the Entenado has no tribe to return, the Spanish Entenado has no tribe to return. Thus, he remains with the Colastine for over 10 years until another Spanish expedition arrives. They hand him over to his countrymen, who treat him with great suspicion, but not least because he has forgotten his native language and must relearn it. Eventually, he is placed in the care of a priest named Quesada in Spain, who teaches him to read and write. After Quesada's death, he becomes a beggar, but then encounters a theater troupe. The director listens to his incredible story and encourages him to write a play about his experience among the salvajes, the savages, to play the lead role himself. The play is an incredible success, first in Spain, where the troupe performs before the king, and then throughout Europe, where they present the story as a pantomime. The Entenado eventually decides to adopt the children of a murdered actress and moves them to southern Spain, where he establishes a printing press. At the time of the writing of his stories, he's 60 years old and still a prisoner of the experiences he had with the Colastine, which he seeks to explain not only to his readers, but also to himself. El Entenado is based on the myth of the cannibals of the Solís expedition, but it is evident that the author Saer was familiar with other early modern accounts of cannibals, particularly Hans Staden's Wahrhaftige Historia. A woodcut, you can see this here, from Staden's Historia is used on the cover of the first edition of El Entenado. Any reader familiar with Staden's Historia will recognize that Saer's novel is also a commentary on Staden's story, which significantly shaped the European image of the cannibals. This is especially evident in the scenes with detailed description of the cannibalistic practices, and I will skip the details here. However, Saer's intent is not to embellish or to correct early modern narratives of cannibalism. Rather, his project is, and that's what he calls it himself, a speculative anthropology, which delves into the real of cannibalism, the absent cause for the European obsession with cannibalism as experienced beyond the factual accounts. Even the title of Saer's novel, which is never explained or used in the text, narrated by an unnamed first-person voice, hints at the polysemy and the complexity of the text. Entenado, and this is an archaic word, in modern usage means stepson, but with the connotation of son of a prostitute, which the cabin boy indeed is. In the English translation, the Entenado becomes the witness, emphasizing the anthropological aspect because the Entenado is a participant, observer of an exotic culture. In the French edition, El Entenado is translated into l'ancestre, and similarly in the German translation as der Vorfahre. This conveys that in addition to the meanings of orphan and bastard, we have also an antenatus here. It has also been suggested that entenado refers to entenada, a not being, a kind of void. And here you can see, I looked this up before, actually, where am I? Oh yeah, the Italian translation is l'arcano, the secrets, and I still have to process this, I just wanted to put it here. Essentially, the entenado is also an abandonado, an abandoned one. Saer makes this explicit in the novel when Quesada transcribes the Entenado story and his ethnographic description of the Colastine with the title Relación de Abandonado, so the report of an abandoned one. In the moment when the cabin boy falls into the hand of the Colastine, he becomes an abandonado in the sense of Giorgio Agamben. He's abandoned by the law that makes and guarantees the bios, the good life in civilization, and he becomes soe, bare, killable life. The law abandons the entire expedition, which is slaughtered. Although he survives, he remains an abandonado, forsaken by the law of civilization. This signifies a loss of world, as is precisely evident at the moment when the expedition comes into contact with the others and the captain prepares to claim the supposedly terra nullius for the Europeans and make it part of the colonial world. I just read here the English translation. "Land is this without," the captain began to say, as he raised his arm and waved his hand, perhaps trying to reinforce with that gesture the truth of statement he was about to communicate to us. "Land is this without." That was precisely what the captain said when an arrow pierced his throat, so swift and unexpected, coming from the thicket rising behind him. For the Spaniards, the discovered tierra remains pure negativity, absolute loss. Not only is the captain robbed of his life and voice by an arrow in his throat, but the sole survivor also loses his language, or at least it becomes meaningless in the absence of a linguistic community. Thus, he is abandoned by the medium of the symbolic order and is dragged into another world, one that is phantasmagorical for him, with unspeakable excesses, leaving him exposed to the Lacanian real. Therefore, the abandonamiento of the entenado is not only a loss of language, culture, and identity, but also a loss of world. I wandered, extinguished through many worlds simultaneously, where lacking laws to govern them, they intermingled, or rather, through the shells of word, through bloodless lands. The Colacene are also threatened by the loss of the world, for after the orgy, the ensuing melancholic depression, they looked like sick and abandoned creatures. The cannibalistic orgy is an anti-Eucharist, for it makes soul and body sick instead of healing them, destroys community and memory instead of creating and perpetuating them. In this orgy, all are abandoned, forsaken by the world, and exposed to the reality of the unbearable desire. The entenado and the Colacene share the fate of being forsaken by the world, for the prisoner is an outsider and at the same time part of the threatened indigenous world. After 40 years of reflecting on his experiences in the new world, the entenado begins to understand the reason for his abduction and survival. For the Colacene, there is only their own world. They were at the center of the world, the rest uncertain and amorphous, at the periphery. At the same time, it was they who infused reality into the other places they visited. With a mere presence, they were materializing the uncertain and shapeless horizon. However, this world without an outside is precarious. The tree was there and they were the tree. Without them, there was no tree. But without the tree, there was nothing either. They depended so much on each other that trust was impossible. The Indios, he's using that word, could not trust in the existence of the tree because they knew the tree depended on theirs. But at the same time, since the tree contributed with its presence to guaranteeing the existence of the Indios, they could not feel entirely existent because they knew that if existence came to them from the tree, that existence was problematic, since the tree seemed to derive its own from what the indigenous people granted it. The existence of the Colacene in a way is in a way a struggle against annihilation, against the apocalypse. Understanding that it was that for them, that the world seemed so solid, it had to be updated at every moment so that it wouldn't vanish like a thread of smoke in the sunset. Annihilation can only be prevented if the external is internalized and made real. That is the reason for cannibalism. Their desire is absolute, boundless, and without orientation, and therefore insatiable. In a desperate attempt to make the world real, they assimilate and incorporate the other. The pivot point of this process of world-making and the catechontic internalization of the external is the Defki. Sorry, long quote. Defki at the same time meant many disparate and contradictory things. Defki was said to the people who were absent or asleep, to the indiscreet, to those who during a visit, instead of staying at someone else's home for a prudent amount of time, lingered excessively. Defki was also said to a bird with a black beak and yellow and green feathers, at the same time tame, which made them laugh because it repeated some words they taught it. and it had, as if it had spoken. Defki was also a term for certain objects that were placed in the place of an absent person. Perhaps the most important meaning of Defki is witness, which ultimately was also decisive for the title of the English translation. They expected me to duplicate the image they projected of themselves, to mimic their gestures and words, to present them in their absence, and to be capable, when returned to my peers, of acting like a spy or a scout who, having witnessed something in the rest of the tribe had not yet seen, could retrace their steps to recount in detail to everyone. Threatened by all that governs us from the darkness, keeping us suspended in the open air, until one day, with a sudden and capricious gesture, it returns to the indistinct. They wanted a witness, testigo, and a survivor, sobreviviente, of their passage through the material mirage, who could, before the world, be their narrator, narrador. In fact, of the collapse of their own world, the Defki is a narrator, not only a witness, but also a survivor. Horacio Legras aptly observes, entenado and witness are woven together in the question of inheritance, and through inheritance with the issues of testament and survival. The protagonist of Saer's novel does not have to bear witness to the Indians' culture, only to the fact that he is alive and that they are dead. Yet he cannot be completely alive if the world of the Indians has perished. The entenado inherits the legacy of the Colastine, but not in the sense that he is a witness to their reality. Rather, he appropriates their reality. As Eduardo González observes, he finds, that's a quote, he finds in his former captor's memory a gift and sacramental commodity, end of quote. This is the logic of the gift, as postulated by Jean-Luc Marion in his take on phenomenology. According to Marion, experience presupposes that something is given, which the subject receives, the pure given. Givenness and acceptance mutually condition each other and thus create the gift. Therefore, the subject is not prior or autonomous because it is first a recipient and then an agent. The subject is thus a gifted one. Mariot identifies a particular class of phenomena, namely those that are unforeseeable, unbearable, and overwhelming. Phenomena, as he says, in excess, which according to Mariot represent the given par excellence. Marion calls these saturated phenomena. These incomprehensible experiences demand a response. Event and response constitute the phenomenon. They are capable of transforming the subject, radically altering the relationship and embedding in the given. In this case, for the subject, one world ends and it becomes part of a new one. The experiences of the entenado are undoubtedly saturated phenomena. There's an unmaking of his own world which he inherits, through which he inherits the outlook of the indigenous people and participates in their world. However, the bitter irony lies in the fact that he is the only survivor of the indigenous world, doomed to destruction, and that his gift is simultaneously a task to remember this downfall that he did not personally experience. Thus he becomes a post-apocalyptic narrator. El Entenado is distinctly metafictional, more precisely meta-scriptural text. The scene of writing where the old man grapples with the memory in his study, struggling with the world he commits to paper, is recounted in great detail. The chronological narrative is repeatedly interrupted by references to the moment of enunciation and the inevitable mediation of memory through writing. The text that the reader holds in his hand is the final link in a chain of medial and generic transformations of lived experience, the interrogation by the Spaniards, the conversations with Quesada, the text of the play initially performed in verse, then in pantomime, the composition of the manuscript which eventually goes into press. The narrator makes it clear that he is not certain about what he experienced, the truth of his memories, but through writing he truly becomes a witness and generates a reality. The orphan, abandoned by the world for the second time, first when the Colastine captured him, and then when they sent him away, understands this when he is adopted by Father Quesada. I understood that if Father Quesada had not taught me to read and write, the only act that could have justified my life would have been beyond my reach. The justification of his existence is writing, but this is a belated process, nachträglich, always difficult to translate, belated process as emphasized by the distance of several decades between the events in the New World and the composition of the narrative. Faced with the uncertainty of his memories, only writing is real. He does not merely depict reality, but creates it. In this context, it must be noted that writing is not only belated and retroactive, but also spatially decentered regarding the space of events. With Michel de Certeau, one could say that Saer stages an écriture de l'histoire, which initially stems from a geographical break and then a work of returning, as de Certeau says, aiming to establish the self in relation to the other, but is contaminated by unavoidable and unbearable alterity. However, it would be reductive to view Entenado as solely a critical reflection of the colonial economy of writing, because already at the moment when the Entenado loses his world and his symbolic register, namely during his capture and baptism as Defki, he ironically becomes an alphabetical man. As we have seen, he is more than an outsider and witness. In an inclusive exclusion, he becomes part of an oral culture that appears as the other of civilization. The Defki reveals his true nature in another language, more precisely in another writing system. He is the incarnate word, and through his words, the flesh of the cannibals and those they have assimilated becomes word again. The savage or cannibal precedes writing and is simultaneously a creature of writing and imagination. Thus it becomes clear that the Spanish Defki is not one among many witnesses captured by the Colastine during the annual hunting expeditions, but rather the only possible one. The European is always already the reason for the invention of the cannibal, and the cannibal is the other self that the modern subject needs. He is absorbed into the community, but is in multiple ways an exception as the sole European survivor, as a European within the indigenous community, and as the sole survivor of the community. For the Colastine, he is both self and other, the bare life that makes the polis and the bios possible. Hence the reason for slaughtering and devouring the killable life, which dwells both inside and outside and ultimately must not be entirely destroyed, but preserved. In El Entenado, the boundaries between the European self and the indigenous other, between bare life and bios, inside and outside, blur. In his reflections, the narrator makes clear that the Colastine are by no means typical or exemplary for the Americans. The Colastine differ from the other peoples whom they despise, conquer, and kill. Considering the a priori similarities between the Entenado and his host and captors, driven by desperation and yet insatiable hunger, it is suggested that the supposedly indigenous other are also represent the European self. At the heart of darkness, the Entenado finds a projection of his own abandonment, the unbridled European desire that drives colonialism and devours the indigenous people. Considering the doubts that the narrator harbors about the reality of the experiences and often dreamlike quality of the world of the Colastine, one can understand this world as a mirror for the Europeans, just as the Entenado is a kind of mirror for the Colastine. The object of Saer's speculative anthropology is not the indigenous reality, forever lost, but the world of the European conquerors. The indigenous Colastine, the cannibals, are the specters who came with the Europeans to the New World. The Europeans' obsession with cannibalism stems from their own cannibalistic desires and violence. The Colastine's concern to avert the apocalypse is actually a distortion of European apocalyptic thinking, which was one of the driving forces of colonialism and led to the actual end of numerous indigenous worlds in order to build the new world on the post-apocalyptic ruins into which early modern authors inscribed the cannibal in a process of inclusive exclusion. Superficially, cannibalism in early modern texts signifies the consumption of the other, making the cannibal the radical self, the radical other of the self. Saer's novel from the 1980s suggests a different understanding of the relationship between Europeans and cannibals. The cannibalism of the Colastine is an expression and consequence of their poverty of world and their desperate striving to affirm their reality. The Entenado reports that once attempted to achieve this by consuming themselves. When they began to devour and to consume not real men, those who came from the outside, they begin in a double ironic twist of the Hegelian dialectic of master and servant to consume the other, but ultimately leading to their own apocalypse. From Saer's perspective, cannibalism, in contrast to the accounts of early modern travelers and conquerors, is not an anthropological phenomenon, but an expression of the need to project onto the other the European autophagic logic that manifested as the desire to assimilate the world. Thank you.